Thank you so much. Thanks to Al, and thanks so much for Housemans for hosting us. It's really great to be part of this real institution. We tried to get into Google, but they just didn't have space for us, so here we are. It's really, really great to be here. So yeah, this is both our worse, and it's co-edited with Keston Sutherland at Sussex as well, and the kind of original list of invitations was put together with other colleagues and friends there, Joe Walton, Natalia Cicere, Sam Solomon and Sarah Krangle. So we're hoping to put more such things out into the world. Fitzcarraldo, better watch your backs, right? It's happening now. The war is on. The design, it's worth mentioning, of the kind of template that's changed each time was by the great Robbie Dawson, who many of you will know from the posters of High Zero and other places. So a great designer. It's great to work with him again. So, like most poetry publishers, it's not so much a non-profit as actively embracing loss. So, though there will be no great financial rewards, we do try and be generous with booksellers and with author copies. They also do find their way into the world. My favourite is to watch a little map that you can get on the distribution network and see they've turned up in Alaska, which is exciting for me. So I'll turn to kind of introduction that includes a little bit more about the press. And this might kind of spoil the evening for us before it's even really begun. But I was trying to think of the relationship between these two books and wonder if there's something here about reclaiming piety. I'm not going to look at them in case they either strongly agree or strongly disagree with this. I don't know which I prefer. But obviously it was given a bad rap by Nietzsche, and I'm just wondering if it's time to kind of shake the dust off and see how piety feels today. Going back to some of its meanings, like ideas of mercy, ideas of tenderness, ideas of dutiful conduct, I think these might be important. Both include solidarity with the poor in various forms, poor forms of art making, often reduced means, scribbling over the commodity form in much of Danny's work. And as a gesture, I think, of this kind of piety, there's a lot of correspondence in both their works. It's a lot about genuflecting to the talents of others. It's a work of gratitude, I think, both of these. So it's perhaps a fitting gesture for the launch that Matthew also reprints kindly the invitation to Both Are Worse as a press inside his book. So this first describes what we do. Much of it was composed by Keston, as some of you might twig when you hear it. So we expect the project to take shape and find its directions once it gets underway, but as a rough guide to a starting position, the idea is to assemble works of critical prose, engaging with poetry and poetics, in order to stretch some horizons, push out beyond an impasse, heap up obstructions, or make life more difficult or livable in any way that seems compelling, vital, or beautiful. Studies of single authors, histories of communities or forms, manifestos, treatises on metre, philosophies of phonation, provocations of every stripe and blotch, dream diaries, long jokes, spreadsheets or inscrutable swirls of one-dimensional Venn diagrams would all be great, anything that works. So that was the invitation we put out into the world. So tonight I'm going to introduce, first of all, Danny to speak. I'll then introduce Matthew, and after Matthew's reading, we'll have time for Q&A. So we'll run straight through. If anyone does need to take a break, obviously the exits and the bathroom, we'll know which way you're going, but go for it anyway. So Danny Hayward, I'm delighted to introduce a poet, critic, and near-professional translator, he was saying earlier. His critical works... It's all true. His critical work includes Wound Building, Dispatches from the Latest Disasters in UK Poetry from Punctum, and the most recent volume of poetry, is it still the most recent? Is Loading Terminal from 87 Press. He runs the archive of out-of-print and inaccessible poetry called Free Trials. This particular book, I think, it tarries with the negative affect and difficulty of staying political in this landscape littered with the immiserated. That's to say, how do we not develop a fealty to immiseration itself, a bond with misery as our own identity, even as we try to keep our eyes open? How not to burn out and burn up? How to find in the call of permanent critique some self-forgiveness, some permission to feel anything for myself, so we don't regard our own emotional damage as owed to the damaged lives we witness, and therefore also treat our own potential joy as somehow disrespect. This, I think, is partly what O'Hara chides as endless torment pretending to be the rose of acknowledgement. This, perhaps, anti-capitalist piety cannot seek reward after life, but might discover a tonal tenderness to the self in order to help maintain obligations to the other. I'm really super thrilled to welcome Danny.
Hello. Thanks, Sam. Does this work? It does work. Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm not really able to think this evening, but I'm kind of see, I'm proving it already, like 6 words in. Deliriously happy, which is like good for me, if not, for you. This book, if anyone hasn't seen it already, is like one kind of fake essay or joke essay, and then one long letter, and then like 5 blog posts from a blog which still exists and is still kind of ongoing, called Community of Goods. Anyone can submit to it in principle, but the blog was initially set up as a sort of prong or arm of a series of meetings that took place at Mayday Rooms in Fleet Street in the first months of 2023. And those were a series of meetings to talk about like poetry and political confusion, effectively. That was the theme. Or political aimlessness or directionlessness or frustration in what felt like a particularly aimless and frustrating moment. And we had about 6 or 7 sessions where we would usually read some political texts which had excited us. We read texts about the feminist uprising in Iran. We read texts about the war in Ukraine. We read the poetry of Anna Mendelssohn. We read a bunch of things. And we were trying to upload minutes of our quite confused discussions to the blog, and short bits of correspondence between ourselves. The idea of the blog is that anyone could share anything there that represented a question for them about poetry or politics. So it was a place for unfinished thinking. And kind of central for me, there was an exchange with my friend William. So the group of us who set up the sequence of discussions were like Helen Demos, Will Rowe, and me. And Will and I were exchanging letters, and we still are. Like, Will sent me a letter 3 or 4 days ago, which I haven't read yet, but they're still coming. So somewhat unfairly, I've like misrepresented the ratio of contributions in this book. So there's like 1 letter by Will and 4 by me, which is not an accurate depiction of what the blog was like. But I'm going to read, instead of the like fake essay and the long letter, just I think 3 blog posts, one of which is by Will, and Will isn't here, he's in Athens, so Will is going to be played or represented by Rob. I can see you, yeah. And I don't know how long that will take, but probably not more than like 18 minutes, 17 and a half, we'll see. So the first of these is called On Denial, 4th of May 2023. I've been trying to think about my feeling that it's getting harder to talk openly about the things that are happening to us. Does the feeling capture something true? What do I even mean when I say this? On reflection, I think that my feeling stands in for congeal several related experiences. 1, of a decline in most of the channels that I can still access, first listservs, now also social media, of anything resembling political debate or even extended discussion. These spaces all resemble bars just before closing time. Only the stragglers are left. Most of them are talking to themselves, etc. 2, of a more complex disintegration of many underground political and artistic communities, the feeling of people not speaking to one another anymore, or of work that continues but with less and less sense of common or communal purpose. Of course, there are counter tendencies. 3. Connected to 2, a loss of the sense that it is worth analysing broad-level political events, a sort of exasperation at the perceived obligation to be able to respond to, or to encompass and meaningfully address, the major events of any particular year or week, as the case may be. The last time I felt a common movement of desire to respond in this way was in the early months of the pandemic. Then responses were filtered into familiar pro and contra positions and hardened into camps. Then silence descended again. 4. More personally, in a way that makes me distrust my own instincts, I feel a growing impatience with the thinking and the intellectual routines of my culture. On the radical left in particular, the prevailing intellectual phase seems to be one of denial. In relation to Ukraine, I see friends and one-time influences either blatantly cherry-picking facts in order to support their obvious preferred conclusions, or else ignoring the war altogether, because thinking about it is painful and can't be operated upon with our preferred conceptual and practical tools. This experience has produced a kind of paranoia. I find myself wondering how much my own historical education has been guided by my desire to arrive at predetermined conclusions. I feel ashamed of what I allowed myself to believe about Kosovo, Libya, Syria. This also holds when my beliefs were agnostic and not polemical. A friend writes to me, quote, I have a sense that the existence of pro-rationalisers of Putin has been a profound shock to you. I suppose it has not been so much for me, having been so shocked by the British left supporting Serbian fascists. This was a useful phrase for me. I realise the existence of pro-Putinism has been a shock for me. It's made me feel as if the ground has been pulled away from under my feet, that I'm suddenly suspended in mid-air, that I have nothing to stand on and no base to which to return. It's more than the feeling of anger or disappointment, because it's possible to feel angry and disappointed without feeling personally implicated. For the first time in my life, I do feel personally implicated. I no longer want to defend my tradition against deviations. It's the tradition itself that feels corrupted and untrustworthy. Also, the tradition is inside of me, and I know neither how much of it is false nor what authority can actually disclose this. Something deep inside you sustains a painful injury. You feel instinctively that it might not be fixed anymore. You can't tell yet how much is broken. You know that something has snapped, but you can't bring yourself to look directly. You still want to believe that it might be all in your head, so you continue to look away, and your body fills with adrenaline, and this adrenaline is translated into panic or despair or fury directed against those who have betrayed you. But the injury is inside you, and you know that eventually you will have to look. Something's there. I felt like this now for more than a year. The feeling hasn't abated. I want to look now. I know that in this period 100,000 soldiers have been blown to pieces and millions of people have had to permanently abandon their homes. I know how de rigueur and empty sentences like that have become. I originally wrote, how fucking empty, but I no longer think empty signifiers of vengeful rage transmit any particular emotional content. Quote, I yell shit down a cliff of the ocean. Even in my lifetime, the immediacy of that word will fade. It will be dead as, alas. What I do have is the urge to confess, and I want to understand why it is that feels so difficult to talk. And I want to understand why it is that it feels so difficult to talk to one another. I wanted to say something about the last time something like this happened. Between 2016 and 2018, we all observed a small group of friends and comrades translate their feelings of exclusion, shame, and wounded narcissism into hatred of the community of the radical left. It was a novel spectacle. We gossiped about it and tut-tutted. We all knew that the emotional damage came first and that post hoc intellectual apostasy only later. The period 2016 to 18 provided the perfect stage for this kind of intellectual theatre. But the stage keeps on getting wider and wider, and I'm not sure who's in the audience anymore. What does it feel like to look at an incurable wound? I realise that I'm returning to two distinct metaphors here. I realise that my thinking is incomplete and liable to be misunderstood for that reason. I started this project, this blog, because I wanted to try to create a space where we could talk about undecided and unsettled things in a language that is itself unsettled and undecided. I now know that itself requires an expenditure of effort and sensitivity of which I'm not always capable. I feel undecided. I also know how easy it is to say things that I don't mean, or that mean more than I mean to mean. And I know about opportunists and renegades and apostates. The first of the two metaphors I recurred to is the metaphor of an outside. The emotionally damaged ex-leftists of 2016 to 18 talked about stepping outside all the time. They were obsessed with it. The language recurred like a leitmotif in their writing, like a pole star. It was inescapable. It was almost poetic. Something deep inside you sustains a painful injury. You know that something has snapped, etc. But there's no outside to an injury. That's the whole reason why you're not able to look. You know that whatever you see, once you've seen it, will be a part of you, that will be you, for as long as you continue to live. And all you can do is accept that internal reality or deny it, retreating deeper and deeper into a kind of hallucination, a beautiful dream, in which everything's okay and still pristine and just like it originally was, undamaged, brand new, like a new toy or a theory that's just opened your eyes. Looking means accepting that the wound is there, that it changes everything, and that possibility for you from now on will have to be defined through the parameters that it establishes. Not looking means holding on to the possibility of the outside, of exteriority of injury to self, in its attenuated form as a kind of feverish denial, a dream valediction. Which do you choose? What can we do with this limb, this hour, this remnant, this fucked up tradition full of emotionally damaged people, this demi-language, etc.? And what is a theory of political action for someone who is, or equally for a class of people who are, tortured, hunted, imprisoned, injured, or aphasic? Revolutionaries don't like to think about this. The pre-established outputs invalidate the inputs. The problem is relegated to poetry, and poetry regurgitates its usual reservoirs of generic panic and despair. How tasteless. Which metaphor do you prefer? Quote, "The one must sacrifice coherence to the incoherence of life, attempt to create a dialogue, even if that goes against our conscience. That the reality of this small, stingy state is greater than us is always an awesome thing, and one must be a part of it, however bitter that is." I still don't think I'm putting any of this right. I'll post it anyway. Perhaps someone can correct me. What does Pasolini mean by create a dialogue? What does he mean by against our conscience? What does he mean by our? What does he mean by be a part of it? What does he mean? And then Will replied on the 14th of May 2023 through the medium of Rob.
Dear Danny, I address this to you as open dialogue. I want to reply to your recent piece in Reports. The title you gave it is On Denial, a word with strong resonance in current time. I mean that denial has become that kind of word for me, and I will try to say why. There's a subjective satisfaction in the act of denial. The one who says it never happened invokes a certain power, like saying X didn't happen, or not in the way you say it happened. The X could be Grenfell Tower, the event of it covered by a massive legal procedure that wraps itself around justice. The you being those who were burnt to death, or the voice that has to speak for them. That's a case of implicit denial, the subjects being the companies that issued the cladding materials, the local council, the government, the majority of the media. Inside the self, we know that denial manages to put something else in the place of damage suffered, something that can cover it while also perpetuating it. But there's another kind of denial also, which doesn't respond to knowing, since it expunges, removes the very space in which a thing has occurred or is occurring. This is not to say that the damage event that's denied is inexpressible. Fran Locke calls it horseflesh. But such forms of expression are strictly non-exchangeable. They are thought figures which are forbidden to drift above themselves and be creamed off. Not allowing thought figure to drift into the sphere of exchange is a principle that gets laid down at the beginning of your poem, Loading Terminal. It's very hard not to slide into some kind of denial inside the intractability of current crises, political, ecological, but also crises of language and thought. Language exhausts itself quickly. I mean language in its function of is, of predication, of naming. Freud's notion of binding came into the conversation at the recent Mayday Rooms meeting. Freud's use of that term, where binding works in terms of an energy which flows along chains of ideas and implies associative links, suggests a possible crossover between inner life and the political outside. When you write, there is no outside to an injury, are you posing this as an outside where resolution might have been possible? I want to say that a wound with no outside is the pair of a situation with no solution, a situation where words are stuck in chains of association that perpetuate an impasse. Not that individual wound and social wound are homogeneous, but that they exist in a certain relation to each other. What kind of relation? The insistent trauma talk of narcissistic selves falsifies the relation. Once you accept that life is suffering, you can accept the challenge of living. That's Jordan Peterson speaking. And inside his voice, the long history of voices that have said that suffering is an entirely internal matter, a belief highly acceptable to capitalism. Individual wound and social wound are not homologous, but what they have in common is isolation. Rimbaud's poem, The Drunken Boat, sums up a basic element of leftist tradition. To break all moorings, the call to rebellion as radical subjective unbinding, the legacy of the Paris Commune gathered into that call, that cell of meaning. That Rimbaud got labelled a poet maudit was a maneuver of bourgeois literature. We know that. The boat lands in Africa and finds itself facing white men with firearms. Subjective emancipation includes colonial violence. That's the corrective to individualism. But the binding undone without new binding consisting of a changed social order, does it go where we need to go? Does it merely end up bending to a new master? That seems to be more a question for those like myself who experienced 1968. All things come into their comparisons, Robert Duncan wrote in the 1960s. Now everything seems to face its limit. Not just emancipatory politics, but ideas of the commons and the collective and of political will as such. I'm not arguing for the abandonment of that tradition. You refer to people who have done that. But that our account of where we are should acknowledge the unmooring of ideas from their historical basis, right down to the linkage of words in their phrasing. I'm reminded of the slogan that headed an announcement of the recent International Workers' Memorial Day. It said, "Mourn for the dead, fight for the living." It might have been better the other way round. Then there wouldn't have been the illusion of a place to fight from. So, to mark some conditions that determine our situation, wars in Europe and the Middle East, resurgence of oil and arms industries, postponement of any real state-level action to resolve climate crisis, inability of states and ruling classes to guarantee survival, political chaos, these add up to time for new analysis, critique of inherited models for revolution. Critique, for instance, of the thinking that assumed that the Soviet Revolution constituted a necessary pathway for struggles in other places, but also critique of flat rejection of the Bolshevik experience, as well as critique of capitalist subjectivation in ourselves, including the production of isolation. I was going to write the production of isolation and confusion, but attributing confusion simply to action of the political enemy seems one-sided. At least, I sense that a future Mayday Room's discussion of confusion might have to take that on.
I'm just going to read one more. So, a response that I wrote on the 25th of May, 2023. Dear Will, thank you for responding, for opening this up into a conversation. I think you're right to push us back towards things that are actually happening, the conditions which determine our situation. Those are the hardest things to talk about, but I'll try at least to follow you in the direction. Towards the end of your letter, you talk about Rimbaud's unbinding as a basic element of leftist tradition, to break all moorings. You also say that we presently feel unmoored, that this unmooring is the default, and that we should acknowledge the unmooring of ideas from the historical basis, right down to the linkage of words in their phrasing. This recalls to my mind Stephen Hastings King's metaphor in the text we discussed in our first Mayday Rooms meeting. We float, he wrote, like plankton, near the surface of an online sea. And so unmooring itself becomes unmoored, is no longer a call to rebellion as radical subjective unbinding. And the unmooring that seems nearest to us is not the unmooring we know from Rimbaud, but for the one that was immortalised in Mayakovsky's suicide poem. in which the love boat has smashed against convention, or the devastatingly prosaic unmooring of tiny isolated floating organisms which serve as food for larger, more complex systems. Capital, for example. Plankton meaning to drift, or wander in a sea. So is this part of what at the end of your letter you call confusion? That we no longer know what it means to rebel? The mark made on our intellectual lives by years of fascist provocation is obviously relevant here, but there are other things at stake too. In the first draft of the reply I wrote to you, I finished by saying that, quote, "For a long time I felt really sick, and now I feel less so, and I want to talk about why." I've been thinking a lot recently about Ernst Bloch's The Principle of Hope, this giant luminescent encyclopedia of images of the other world scattered through human history in fairy tales and myths and scientific theories and music. Yesterday, when I first tried to get down my response, I made an attempt to talk about this hope in terms of space and poetry. I wrote about Satan's passage through chaos in Paradise Lost, and Pasolini's testimony in which he describes walking all night long through filthy suburbs in search of sex. The sex is a pretext, he says, and about Alice Rohon, who says that, for a while now, I've lived inside a map on the wall. And that wasn't wrong exactly, but the emphasis isn't in the right place. What I want to describe to you is a feeling that there isn't space anymore. There isn't space for us to think, that all of the available positions have been occupied already by something foul, and that wherever we go, we find ourselves in the same cramped room, surrounded by our enemies. And when in your email you point out to me that the grifting conservative psychologists also instruct us to, quote, accept the challenge of life, quote, as in one of my proselytizing moods I might also have done, I feel a trace of this claustrophobia rise up in me again, a thin sheet of panic that's been working its way through my body for years now, and which acquires another layer every time I try to think. About what radical politics is. And always there's this sense that I'm standing in the middle of a room surrounded by people who I can't bear. And if I try to move away from one person, I move closer to another. And the doors on either side of the room are marked acceptance and denial, and both lead into another identical room where the same problem is repeated. I said earlier that I want personal pain to be undignified, that I want to accept, not to deny, that political concepts will cover it badly, that I want to accept that the pain will stick out or bulge in ways that seem unseemly or gross or ridiculous. I said that I want to find that fucking funny and for the comedy to be, as it were, communally recognised, and not grounds for personal affront or retreat into vast vanilla terrain of aristocratic interior self-regard, disdain for mass politics, educated immunity to illusion, etc. For a long time I felt really sick, and now I feel less so, and I want to try to talk about why. And clearly this is a thought about how things fit together or don't, and about what it means to talk about coherence or cohesiveness. Along with the block, I've been reflecting the way Pasolini could say the most reactionary things and yet expect them to mean something different to what they seem to mean, because poetry in his conception opens up into the unexpected space inside of our own bodies and in political parties and suburbs and the ideas of reactionaries and teenage boys, as well as communists and mothers and lovers and streets, because he still knew how to rebel, or maybe just because he wasn't afflicted by this mindless claustrophobia like us, which we only call confusion because we've forgotten that there is something that needs to be done, beyond organising concepts and their relations to each other. And because we no longer see that the more organised these concepts become, the more confused we tend to be, because each of them becomes more and more like a point on a grid or a node in a system of coordinates that have no internal dimensions and no field of possibilities, and so no fucking principle of hope either. And we're trapped inside of those points, feeling claustrophobic and confused, wondering whether we should have started another one of those nice abstract conversations about feelings. There is no outside to injury, I write thoughtfully. So at least now we have a list of terms: incoherence, confusion, and claustrophobia. I'm tempted to say that we also have a list of counter terms: coherence, lucidity, ability to move, but that feels too convenient, and anyway, like I say, excessive coherence is an aspect of claustrophobia, not its antidote. Rather, I think the point should be about finding a way to move backwards through the sequence, from claustrophobia through confusion and back out again into the incoherence of life, where space opens up inside of things unexpectedly, and it's a part of our, one might call it, intellectual training to prepare ourselves, meaning to make sure that we're ready when it happens. And can I try to lever a question out of this? Is it possible to talk, Will, about the very large things you mentioned at the end of your letter: wars in Europe and the Middle East, resurgence of oil and arms industries, postponement of any real state-level action to resolve climate crisis, inability of states and ruling classes to guarantee survival, political chaos, or to oppose them, without feeling like they are themselves the walls that are closing in, the answers that have been poured like concrete into their questions, the wall of convention that Mayakovsky's Love Boat smashes into? If I feel less mentally, quote, sick now than I did, and if I keep repeating this, is because I want to convince myself that it's true. It's because I've stopped screaming at myself. I've stopped telling myself to piece things together. I'm trying to meet things differently, to ask different questions of them. I don't ask them to behave like keys. Does this make sense? Quote, to know how to recognize and pick up the signs of power we are awaiting, which are everywhere, end quote, Tristan Tzara. And specifically, Tzara says to pick them up, like radio signals in the air, rather than to bend them out of shape like picks for a self-invented lock and a single self-imposed theoretical door. I know this must sound stupidly obvious, but it's a principle of hope for me. So I'll end there. But probably not many of you have read Matthew's book yet, but for me there are tons of points of connection. So yeah, thank you, Sam, for the project of the series and allowing this to happen. Really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really amazing, and the dedication to seeing through the difficulty there is just astonishing. Yes, I'm very, very thrilled to introduce Matthew Goulish. The mostly a joke version of this introduction is to say that Matthew is one of the few non-poets who works with poetry in his art, in his case dramaturgy, without my cringing or flushing with embarrassment. That's partly true for poets and poetry as well. And that's partly due to his taste. So Matthew and other collaborators work with the poetry of Mina Loy, with Paul Celan, with Robert Creeley, with Jay Wright, and in this case, Ed Robeson. Lynn Hickson, who's also here this evening, and Matthew Goulish formed Every House Has a Door in Chicago in 2008 after turning the page on the seminal theatre group Goat Island, that developed a number of works, including its Shifting Hank, The Sea and Poison, and the last of which, called The Last Maker, was an absolute revelation to me. Matthew's beautiful critical writing can be found in the multi-authored Small Acts of Repair, really central work, the co-authored Pitch and Revelation on the work of Jay Wright, and a small but wonderful selection called 39 Micro-Lectures in Proximity of Performance. Matthew describes Pitch and Revelation as premised on a reading of joy as a foundational philosophical concept. And like much of their theatre work more generally, I think Matthew is beautiful at asking simple questions and waiting with ostensibly simple words until the resonance patiently works its way through a thought. I'm thinking here of the last work of Goat Island, The Last Maker, which asks, amongst other questions, how do I build a life? And when is something beyond repair? This work I won't introduce too much, but works around questions of noticing and of attention, collective and individual. The work circles around poetry and the performance that is teaching, so it's a particularly interesting Venn diagram for me, thinking about how to communicate, and discovers through its correspondence the collective reading of one poem. It feels to me that it has a sense of piety in its tenderness, in a work of patience, of dutiful conduct, of sincerity in its thought, and reminds me of a quotation I first read in a really great little book called A Choreographer's Handbook by Jonathan Burrows from Federico Paredes, whose work I don't know otherwise. But Paredes says, I'm interested in the idea of treating simpler things with the intensity that you would treat things that are virtuosic. I'm interested in the idea of treating simpler things with the intensity that you would treat things that are virtuosic. And I love this sense of how much resonates from simple questions and simple openings. Thank you so much.
I want to start by acknowledging the Chicago poet Ed Robeson, who wrote the poem Kingfisher that commanded my attention and that appears in its entirety at the start of and in order to start my book of the same title. by thanking Sam Ladkin and Both Are Worse Press for the process and material actualization of my book, and for Danny Hayward's book, and for the pairing of the two. It's a great honor to meet Danny and to read here tonight in that fresh companionship. And by thanking Al Anderson and the Storied Houseman's Bookshop, which operates again tonight so valuably as a haven for public creativity and sanity within which to gather. When we read a poem, when we try our best to comprehend what the poem has done to us, we may engage three modes of interaction: an individual confrontation with the words and their lines on the page, reading as closely as possible; a conversation with other readers about how they read the poem, a communal inquiry; and a consideration of what the author has said or written outside of the poem. These three modalities gave my little book its structure and its contrasts, although they shade into one another, never manifest in complete independence, while remaining entirely distinct. They gave me the courage to write to the novelist Renee Gladman and the historian Michelle Arnosky-Sherburne, both of whom ended up contributing to the book, and to quote extensively from an interview conducted by Lynn Heginian, who has since left us. With all of that in mind, I will read from the two parts of the book: the first, an intricate and solitary interaction with the poem, and the second, a conversational recollection. When a poem takes hold of us, we might want to trace how it came to appear before us, the constellation of material events that introduced us. Finally, we might recognize a fourth dimension of reading in the way we directly perceive what the poem perceives, out there in the world, flying, or diving, or perching, or migrating into a further geography and history, how the poem alters our perception. The alteration, a resuscitation, and a blessing. Ed Roberson's poem begins this way. Glimpse something drop, like fruit from a branch of trees along the river, then fall back up to its perch. You've caught the kingfisher burst from its dive, back into position over the water, nearly invisible rain. And my commentary begins this way. Limne. Attention. Our words, our poems, begin by accident. This one begins with an accidental sighting along the river. When I say accident, I mean interruption and the redirection that follows of what had been attention. Whatever had been the subject of that attention lies now beyond the scope of the poem, of no consequence, forgotten in the void of the poem's outside. Now this attention takes hold if we allow it. How do they differ, these two attentions? One leads and one follows. The one that leads, we choose. The one that follows chooses us. The one that follows activates us beyond expectation. A glimmer, even a distraction, already passed before it became present to us. How do we attend to it, this turning within a moment? The conflict between attention and distraction reveals apprehension's dual polarity. The redirect between the two we now call to pay attention with justice, the curiosity and the even-handed, just curiosity. This second attention that follows what we never sought. It will take us where we must go if we have prepared properly to recognize it as guide. Because, like the poem says, you have to be in a position to jump. Glimpse. To turn oneself around. To suggest that poetry does not begin with one's words at all, but with being accosted by that which one was not seeking. Glimpse, and it has caught you, that sense of irreality of the film running in reverse. The peripheral drop that one had no intention of seeing, dropped as an ordinary interruption to attention. Newton's apple, in its fall, speaks of Newton's universe. For that sidelong moment, we think we live there, then fall back up to its perch. The revelation of the impossible experience uncovers the fact of the world in the act of exceeding our mind's model of it. Cavell, speaking after Emerson, says, "It is where you first encounter yourself. It is where the sense of irreality of your existence and the necessity for turning yourself around first presents itself. The sense of irreality in experience is specified as a loss of the direction in which reality is to be found, that it is not ahead. Reality no longer constitutes our goal, prefigured, toward which we directed ourselves. We find it to one side. We find it only when it follows and allows us, when it illuminates, when, in activating itself, it calls to us and we hear and recognize the call. In turning to that horizon, in reversing course, we encounter ourselves. When Cavell replies, "It is where," the "it" refers to the cave, in response to the question, how is it that the cave is the actual ordinary? In time, we will speak more of justice, actual ordinary justice, and of caves. And the second half of the book begins this way. Correspondence. More than one friend has named as favorite the kingfisher. When regarding birds, what exactly does favoritism mean? I wonder in particular about such attachment for non-birders, for those of us who devote our lives to this or that discipline that considers birds, if at all, only peripherally, but who nevertheless stop and notice. Two talked to me specifically about this bird's head. Jack, an architect, texted me that he used to see them along the Boardman River near Traverse City in northern Michigan. The size of its head in relation to its length is both odd and captivating. And I remember riding in a car with Iris, a horse trainer, driving near Harvard, Illinois, where she said she would occasionally spot one near the area's lakes. She described how the bird projected its upper parts forward in flight, giving it the appearance of awkward vulnerability. "I'm worried about your head," she spoke as if addressing the kingfisher. "Isn't that dangerous? Can't you pull it in?" I have a large volume to which I turn frequently, and not only in writing this. The Smithsonian Handbook's Birds of North America Western Region by Fred J. Alsop III. I have just now, for the first time, taken a moment to review all of the 9 birds that it pictures on its cover, each with its identifying name in small text immediately below the image. Acorn woodpecker, lesser goldfinch, Allen's hummingbird, red phalarope, sharp-shinned hawk, the large centerpiece, American woodcock, bobolink, verdin, and belted kingfisher. What would we call this striking collection if not an assembly of favorites? These cover images depict 7 birds perching, one red phalarope, noted in the book as pelagic in winter, swan-like on water's surface, and one in dramatic flight, the kingfisher, wings extended, back, head thrust forward. This encyclopedic handbook brings birds to my attention. It tells me that they exist out there and shares its portraiture of appearance, behavior, and migratory patterns in clinical detail with maps and diagrams. Ed Roberson's poem does something altogether different. For me, it stands in for a sighting. Maybe in this way it operates as a secular prayer to grant a wish for such an encounter. I would like to see for myself this creature's wrongness, the off-balance build that enchants not only my friends, but apparently nearly everyone. We seem to hold a special place in our hearts, we who care about such things, for asymmetries. The fiddler crab with one outsized claw, the top-heavy pelican. Do we identify with them, these perfect imperfections? Do we aspire to them? Maybe this captivation, this casual hold they have over us, and this concern reflects back to us a soul, our own, inhering in a spirit or guardian creature. It will appear at our crucifixion, if only we were to know it. As the testimonies of my 2 noted friends make clear, we must see for ourselves in order not only to believe but also to adopt, to project these creatures inward as companions. In childhood fishing trips overnight to northern Michigan for sunfish or even up into Canada for walleye pike, I heard the loon over the lake. The high extended pitch and its fall into decrescendo seemed a voice cast out across the placid expanse. The sounds became one with morning mist dissipating at dawn. Amazingly to me, the only image I had for the unseen bird had been impressed onto a Canadian coin like a totem, authenticating what I had experienced as its mysterious importance. I made a point of keeping one in my pocket and taking it out to look at it, or simply touching it when I heard the call. Transmission from the code figure of birds, as Roberson wrote in another poem. Come morning, thin air, auguries loon, singing its insides out of sight. Now I wonder about those like the kingfisher whose presence I have never experienced. The handbook describes its call as bold, raspy rattle sounds like a heavy fishing reel. Philosopher Charles Hartshorne, better known for his process theology, wrote one book that he described as an interpretation and world survey of birdsong. In the chapter on the less well-equipped singers, he states, the kingfisher group consists almost entirely of visually distinctive, poorly concealed birds, many of them fairly large. They live in open forests. They are mostly without music. I treasure the strange creature that I have come to know from this portrait, cobbled from any available second-hand description, and from the encyclopedic statistics, like the star charts of Walt Whitman's learned astronomer, the proofs, the figures ranged in columns before me, the charts and diagrams, to add, divide, and measure them. But unlike Whitman, I cannot walk out to apprehend, as simply and reliably as gazing up at the night sky in 1867, the truant kingfisher, as if the bird has a responsibility to show up for me. Until I have a sighting of my own, the kingfisher occupies a hallowed place, consecrated, like the objective of a quest, but not an object, a sentient creature with its own necessities that have nothing to do with me. I ask then, will the kingfisher show itself to me, or anyway show itself in my presence, at a moment when I am able to pay the right kind of attention? Until that occasion, which may never come, stuck more or less as I am for an unknown duration here in this pocket of Chicago, I thought this poem would substitute. But it has only compounded the strangeness. It presents the act of fishing down and back again like a further impossibilization of this bird, this king of the material accident. At this point in my life, with no other expectation, I turn to this poet. He has crafted an intimate knowledge of the bird and an intricate language for the intimacy. I look out and listen in. I trace it as best I can. And from the final section, it's not a mystery, so I'm going to read the end. On September 2nd, 2 days after I wrote to Renee Gladman, I cast out another line in the form of a letter on paper sent through the mail to Michelle Arnosky-Sherburne, historian of abolition and the Underground Railroad in New Hampshire and Vermont. My essay, I thought, needed one more voice to fill in the background of the final turn in Kingfisher with its tenor of heightened vigilance. The materials that resulted from this inquiry and from the historian's extraordinary generosity in a correspondence with me that lasted 2 years became so substantial that I devote the next section of this essay entirely to them. Before relinquishing the floor to Michelle Sherburne, I will offer my own conclusion, a simple one, to this essay, or this part of the larger essay. If the second, it remains provisional, which is perhaps best, for the restraint to which it subjects my voice. This conclusion, if I may call it that, makes of my function as writer a tentative one, which must have, in this part by now, become apparent. Anyway, the conclusion is this. Reading a poem properly becomes out of necessity a collective endeavor. By reading, I mean considering every receivable element, from the poet's initial act of composition, the devising or isolating of its immediate elsewhere, to the material inking of the words, settled on the common transport of their pages, sequenced between their covers, to the conceptual returns of every resonance, the meanings and branching interpretations, and all the impalpable tributes of context. By collective, I must mean, community, however loosely defined and porous, of colleagues and strangers whom the poem brings together. The poem catalyzes friendship, then, if we let it. It becomes our communion. We have the poem, if even nothing else,